Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the meeting, which is about the rivalry between China and the United States. One special feature being the discovery of large numbers of new missile silos in northwestern China, and you will meet the man who discovered it. This week, we have had an international conference in Oslo on nuclear stability issues in East Asia. Not only in East Asia, South Asia as well. And that conference marks at the same time the end of a two-year project on the same issue, strategic stability in Asia, which has been going on for actually more than 2 years because of the pandemic. That made us stretch the whole thing. And we decided to invite the presenters at one of the sessions, the session on China and the United States, that relationship, to go public. And there are 3 of them. Hans Kristensen, already standing here, from the Federation of American Scientists, is known to specialists all over the world for his nuclear notebook and column in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, also for the coverage of nuclear force issues for the SIPRI yearbook, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and for his many contributions not only about nuclear forces but also doctrines and security issues in general. He will make the main presentation, 25 up to 30 minutes, then briefer comments by the 2 other panelists at the conference. My good colleague Henrik Hiim, who has been heading the project that I mentioned at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies and also NUPI, part-time at NUPI, and Nicola Leveringhaus, King's College, London, who has been inter alia a visiting scholar at Tsinghua University in Beijing, and who is a specialist on Asian security issues, Northeast Asia and China in particular. You will have the floor in that order, but here is the man who made that discovery I mentioned. And you are in a sense a guest of honor in that connection. Very good to see you here. Very good to have you go public. We have been meeting earlier in the week with civil society representatives, a smaller group, but this is the first public presentation in Oslo of that issue. Hans?
Thank you, Sverre. Thank you. I'm deeply honored to have been invited here. I've known Sverre for many, many years, going back to the 1980s, late 80s and early 90s. In those days, the issues in the world were different, but in a strange way, we're coming back to some of the same themes here again because of nuclear weapons. I'm going to give you a short tour of what we have, what we can see that China is doing. And this time, we are in a unique position that we can monitor a lot of what they're doing with commercial satellite imagery. Previously, that was something that was exclusively for people with top secret clearance inside the ministries of something. But today, any fool who has a laptop and some money can do that from there. But of course, the challenge is not just to look at the pictures, but try to interpret correctly what they show. So this hopefully will give some indication of that. I will talk a little about the projections, how high do different governments think that the Chinese will go, and talk about what it means and how China fits into U.S. nuclear strategy, how the 2 look at each other. This has serious implications for international security issues and certainly what's happening in the Pacific region. I'll talk a little about sort of arms control at the end of it in terms of potential options for regulating some of these things. But It's very difficult, as you will see later on. I'll prefer, of course, we have questions after, just so I can get through it and keep the timing. So I hope that works. The Chinese nuclear development has sort of appears to have two big sort of phases. One is sort of up to now, and one is what they appear to be working on. The point here is that what the Chinese are doing right now are significant by all standards that we've seen previously in the Chinese case. This is a nuclear modernization level or degree that we just have never seen before. So the big question is to figure out what does that mean and what are the implications of it. So I've just listed some of their traditional characteristics of their nuclear posture in the past and some of the new one. These slides, of course, will be available to any of you later on if you want to download them from our websites and things like that. You can use them as reference material. But the key here is that they're moving from a small minimum deterrent force to a medium force that is medium in the sense that the United States and Russia are up here and all the other nuclear weapon states are down here. So this is a change from the Chinese perspective. I'll get into all sorts of implications about what this might mean. But there are also a couple of elements of their nuclear policy that might not change, but it depends on where they're going. This is sort of a rough, you don't need to read the details here, but this is just a rough overview of their nuclear delivery systems. And where I put the red dots and the pink dots, the red are the ones that are new, that are being introduced. So a significant change. And the pink ones are the ones that have been updated. The deployment mode will be changed or something like that. But it's across the board. So it's a very broad modernization plan. I have to say that China is not the only country that's modernizing nuclear forces. The Russians are doing it too, the United States, all the nuclear weapon states are busy modernizing the nuclear forces. But the Chinese is more about the growth than just about extending the nuclear arsenal. Now, like I said in the past, monitoring this development was something for people inside with top secret clearance. Today, with commercial satellite imagery, we can monitor the Chinese missile bases. We can see when they grow. We can see what kind of launchers for nuclear systems are visiting the base, are visible from time to time. In this case, it's a missile integration base, not a fully sort of operational launch-ready base, but it's one where they work on integrating this particular system, which is their new intercontinental ballistic missile, the DF-41. We can't see the missile, but what we can look for are indicators that show the operation of this type of missile. And one of them here is a shelter that they use in the training areas where they're training the rocket forces. And then they also use them here at the bases. And these shelters, they have certain characteristics depending on what kind of launcher it is. So you don't see the launcher, but you see that they're working on that particular launcher at this particular site. We also see very important modernizations underway in the medium-range force. Those are systems that are not intended to reach across the Pacific all the way to the United States or all the way to Europe, but these are systems that are intended to reach bases in South Korea, or in Japan or Guam, or places like that, in the region around. And here we can see, of course, two major systems. One is DF-26. This is an intermediate range system that's coming in. It is unique in the sense that it has a warhead section here that is dual capable. So you can put a warhead on that's conventional, or you can take that off and you can put another one on that's nuclear. And you can make that swap out in the field. So that raises a number of issues about potential misunderstandings and the tense crisis and things like that, reading exactly what's going on and not misinterpreting things. This one is a hypersonic glide vehicle that they're putting in, the DF-17. We see that coming in, the launchers, at 3 different bases in China right now. It's a program in progress. It is not as numeral as this one. This one is massive, like 200 to 300 launchers already across China, many different bases. This could be, in the future, one of the core medium and intermediate range systems, basically almost possibly replacing most of the older systems they have. This satellite photo is interesting because one of the early photos that were leaked, satellite photos that were leaked from the United States at some point back in the mid-1990s, showed this base with another missile that used to be there, which was a liquid fuel medium range missile. Liquid fuel means it has to have fuel trucks to fuel it. These are solid fuel, so they don't have all that other infrastructure. So we've been able to follow this particular site with these satellite photos and see how that old system was gradually replaced, first by one that was called the DF-21, and now this one with the DF-26. So that whole flow of technologies coming in and out is something you can actually monitor on these systems. What's getting most of the attention now, of course, is that China has started construction of a significant number of structures in the desert that we interpret as being silos under construction. Silos for long-range, presumably, ballistic missiles. So far, we're monitoring something in the order of about 330 silos under construction in 3 large sites and a little training site. They're located up here in these sections, and this discovery was made just over the course of a few months last year. And we discovered, our team discovered one of them, which was the Hiim site up here. There was another team at the Modernization Institute that discovered this site, and then there was a research unit associated with the U.S. Air University that discovered this site. And so just within a very short span of time, non-governmental, more or less, organizations were able to sort of publish this. The military, of course, had been talking about this for a long time in the intelligence community, but it was all secret. They couldn't talk about it. They couldn't tell the public what they were looking at. So when the public was told the Chinese are going to double their nuclear arsenals over the next decade, people were like, really? Where's the infrastructure? Show us where, that doesn't really quite fit anything. So by making these discoveries, making them available to the public can now have a conversation with the intelligence community and military about, A, what is it? What are the implications? This is very important for understanding the future of the Chinese nuclear development. There's also a little area here that's called Jilantai, which is a training area I discovered a few years ago. And what made the discoveries of these two possible were the features that we discovered at this site. It made it possible and very easy to use satellite photos to look at other features. This is a picture of the site. It's like several hundred kilometers long, and it's covered with these little pads, launch pads that they use. You can vaguely see one of them here where the road comes in. There's a concrete pad, and they use them to sort of set up the launcher there and practice the correct alignment of the missile and also the command and control and the launch of the missile itself. We didn't know about this site until a few years ago, and what triggered it was that the Chinese had introduced a new unit of this DF-26 intermediate range missile. They were very proud of telling the public that they had done this, and it was now under its way to a training area. But they didn't give any details, of course. So, but they released a photo and a video of it. And this showed a salty lake in this area and very clear road systems, a particular pattern. And it only took about an hour to find this by going over the Chinese landscape. There are only so many salt lakes with these kind of features right next to them. And then I started, so this is where it was, and then I started looking for these pads, and within just a few weeks, I had identified more than 140 pads in this area, bases under construction, major bases under construction, and camps where the units would go out and train and do whatever they're doing. But it was features at this site that enable us to look for other stuff elsewhere. And the site was amazing because in the central base area, they lined up the launchers, the new kind of launchers, and some of them older, that were out there roaming around and practicing their stuff. And Chinese, of course, military, very orderly. They like this, so they set them up here on the parking area, the same way that they roll them through Beijing, so we can compare sizes and features of the particular missiles, which helps us identify what is actually roaming around at the different bases. We discovered, as part of this, what looked like construction of silos. At first, there were 4. This was in 2019. They look very much like Russian intercontinental ballistic missile silos, very different from what the Chinese have done before. After we published it, it made its way into the Defense Department's annual report over Chinese nuclear developments, so they confirmed it that way. And the key feature that we discovered that helped us a lot was this inflatable structure that they had raised over each silo construction site to protect not only against satellites looking at the details inside the structure, but also to protect the climate, against the climate, the construction site against dust storms, temperature differences, humidity variations, these types of things. These stand out like a sore thumb on a satellite photo. And so here's a picture of the site we discovered that shows the extent of this grid of roads with each of these little end dots is one of these bubbles. So from a great distance, we could see this pattern, and we can, there they are. And when they were setting this up, this is before they inflated it. This tarp is laid out across, and the middle of it, you can see it has sort of sunk in, showing the outline of the hole being, excavated for the silo itself. Sometimes Chinese television, the military, likes to show its operations, and these videos are really valuable because you can see a lot of stuff. And here is a DF-41 inside a tent, inside a camouflage, but out in the background, you can see one of these bubbles from these silos. So by seeing the alignment, what the horizon looks like, any features that are in the territory, we can pinpoint exactly where this camp is and where this picture was taken. And when they take off that top, well, what you see is an outline in the middle that is presumed to be a missile hatch that eventually will be, structured so they can open, a missile can be in, and all the kind of things. There's a mount, a dirt mount, there's an access road, and there's a turn radius. And the point is here that once it becomes operational, a truck loaded with a missile will come in, but it has to rear up to this and hoist the missile in. So first it swings out here, then it rears in there on the pad. They do their thing, they drives away, and they close the lid, and then it becomes operational at some point, of course. That is still many years away. This is a lot of construction still going on this site, but it's happening really, really fast. They're also modernizing their submarine fleet, of course. This is a picture from just a couple of weeks ago where you can see 2 additional piers being added to this submarine section on the base. This is where their ballistic missile submarine fleet is operating out of. That is growing, so now they need some more piers to have enough space for these guys. Hard to see on this one, but this is one of them. There's a picture here how it's being maneuvered out by these tugboats and getting ready for deployment. This is a ballistic missile submarine, of course. These are not long range enough to hit the United States or Europe from Chinese waters, but they're building a new one that can do that, or will be able to do that. But in order to get out and operate like a real missile fleet, a missile submarine fleet, it has to be able to hide in the oceans and not be detected. Unfortunately for the Chinese, their current class of ballistic missile submarines is pretty noisy. These are other types of missile submarines, Russian missile submarines, and it's noisier than a Delta III that was built or designed back in the 1970s. So the Chinese ballistic missile submarine would not last long if it sails into the Pacific Ocean. And so it is not yet a real ballistic missile or secure retaliatory capability. It'll have to go through a number of modernizations before they get to that capability. They're also upgrading their force, their bomber force. Here's an example of one of the first bases that are thought to be reconfigured to be a base for these medium-range bombers. They are building them with to carry a big ballistic missile under them and launch that from space, from air. And these tunnels are wide enough to be, you can drive one of these big aircraft in there. They're building new bombers as well. So this is a new leg, if you will, of the Chinese nuclear forces that are coming into creation here. So where does this go? Well, it goes a lot further than we've seen before. This is development of Chinese ICBMs in the past. Here's the projected outcome of these constructions of these silos. The US has about 450 silos. China would come up to about 350 something. Russia has 132 silos. They have a lot of mobiles as well, but in terms of silos. So this is significant development for the Chinese. Number of warheads, many projections. They go from 700 or so in 2027 to at least 1,000 in 2030. In the past, we've seen projections that turned out not to be the case. Too much, too soon. It was always the theme of these projections in the past. This is the new projection. So an insane development. But there's a lot of uncertainty about it. We don't know what they're going to put into these silos. We don't know how many of the silos will be loaded. We don't know how many warheads will go on each missile. So this number comes with a huge uncertainty. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, China, you might be surprised to know, has been a target for US nuclear planning way before China had nuclear weapons, all the way back to the Korean War. And they have gone through various variations. I'm just going to describe a couple of them here. The first one is in 2094. So that is down here. Before that, President Reagan took China out of mainstream US nuclear planning. And the reason was that they wanted to have China to be a partner against the Soviet Union in those days. So they dropped out there, but then things started heating up between East and West, if you will, in the mid-90s out in the Taiwan Strait. And after that, we saw a return of China. They got put back into the mainstream nuclear planning by Clinton, as a matter of fact. And in those days, they were identifying a couple of scenarios, one that could involve China and nuclear and the United States. One had to do with North Korea, some kind of triangular conflict coming out of that. But there was also a second scenario, which was a direct US-China confrontation, most likely coming out of a scenario over Taiwan, for example. This was Clinton doing this. This is ironically a photo from the same year that the guidance was signed that brought China back into nuclear planning. The Chinese president was in Washington, and they were talking about good things, in those days, but other things were going on behind the scene. And Stratcom, the primary command for US nuclear planning, they started building sort of a simulated Chinese nuclear plan that lived in the American computer. It was used by the United States to war game its own war plan against what we thought the Chinese were. Who wins, what are the strike scenarios, all this kind of stuff. And then when the current plan that is in operation started materializing, China appeared here, so behind a black marker. But this is a military chart, so it's alphabetical order. So we can see some of these things like Russia. The tip of the A at the end of Russia sort of sticks out at the end here. And this very short one is, guess which one? Any guesses? Well, that's Iran. Even though Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, they're not in good standings. They have other WMDs, things like that. They're on the list. China as well. So why is China doing this? Well, I put up 5 hypotheses here. We don't know for sure. There's a lot of uncertainty about it. It's probably not one of these, but probably a combination of them. One, of course, is that they simply think that their relatively small nuclear force is too small, too vulnerable to a first strike. Not enough would survive. And the other one is that the new president has declared that China has to be a world-class military power by the middle of this century. And big means big, so we need more nuclear. Therefore, you get more stuff. Efforts to overcome missile defenses, U.S. missile defense system. How do you do that? Well, if you think it can take out your warheads, you deploy more of them. You saturate the missile defense system, so you're sure that your stuff can get through. Maybe the Chinese military itself wants more options, so it's not just like one big bang, but you actually have a couple of steps you can take before you get to the big strategic use of nuclear weapons. And then, of course, cover for more conventional adventures in China's sort of periphery. That's the other issue. If China has more nuclear weapons, maybe the United States would be more reluctant stepping up and defeating China, for example, with an invasion over Taiwan, or something like that. But we don't know. But the US military is saying some stuff, some heavy stuff about why they think the Chinese are doing this and what the implications are. This is not unusual, of course. They need to identify worst case scenarios. That's their job. They're looking for enemies, and sometimes they're way over the top. But this is what's characterizing the US reaction right now to China and what it's doing. And they're assuming the worst. They're assuming essentially the Chinese are building something that begins to look like what the Russians and the Americans have. Very operational, sophisticated weapon systems with weapons on high alert, ready to fly on short notice. Whether they're going to go there, we don't know. But there's no doubt about it that as a result of this, the window of reaction between these two sides will shorten. Chinese leaders, if they develop a posture with nuclear forces on alert, with early warning systems that are detecting an incoming missile attack so they can launch them before they're destroyed, those Chinese leaders will have to learn from mistakes where computers will falsely tell them in the middle of the night that an incoming missile attack is underway. And they will have to decide, just like American presidents and Russian presidents did during the Cold War, that this is just an error on the computer. This is dangerous stuff because World War III can happen from an accident like this. So we're sort of reliving this one again. I don't have time to go into this now, but I just want to end on some arms control potentials. Like, what are the steps that could be taken to try to control some of this? Numerical limits, like New START Treaty, where we say there's a limit on how many launchers you can have, there's a limit on how many wards you can put on them, these types of things. Well, it's possible, but the Chinese are not interested in numerical limitations. They're essentially saying, fine, when you come down to our level or we come up to your level, then we can start talking, but not now. The United States would like it, very much so, but they would prefer one that also involves Russia, so like a triangular type of thing. Operational limits, what you can do with your forces, the types you can develop, how many of them, these types of things. Sublimits, possibly. Certain types, maybe hypersonics, they're willing to talk about. There are some indications like that. More importantly, sort of in the short term, confidence building measures like crisis management, incident agreements to try to avoid the mistakes, trigger much more severe developments. You can also have discussions about strategy. How do we understand each other's strategy? Do we interpret each other's strategy the right way so we don't make the wrong worst case scenarios about what you're up to? Those kind of conversations are very important. And of course also reduce secrecy. I mean, it always helps to tell your adversary that, no, I'm not building 500 missiles, I'm building 100. Don't worry, we're not going there. Basic information like that. That doesn't mean you have to spill all your secrets, but just some basic ideas about how far are you going and what's your intention. I'll stop with that and hand over the baton to you. You want to jump in right away? Do you have your own mic? Okay.
I have my own mic. Thank you very much. There is a Norwegian expression called jumping after Nicola, which I think many of you know. This feels a little bit like it because the work that Hans Kristensen is doing in this field is really, extremely valuable. Not just the silo revelations, which, obviously was a very big deal, but also the continuous work that you have done on, promoting transparency in many ways in terms of not just China, but what other nuclear states
Yes, all of them.
are doing. So
Yeah.
that is really excellent. I wanted to elaborate a little bit on a point you raised there, which is basically the uncertainty that I think the developments that we're seeing now are sort of producing. Because it's frustrating, but I think it's still important that, I mean, these really, really important revelations that we're seeing, not just with the silos, but also with, with the things that China are developing, are creating many questions that we don't really know the answer to. So I guess I'm going to muddy the waters a little bit and pose some questions that I think we need to discuss, but that we still don't really know the answers to. And in particular, the one you raised, like, why are they doing what they are doing? And what are the implications for what we're seeing in terms of Chinese nuclear strategy? What does this mean for Chinese nuclear strategy, right? To start off, as you indicated too, we have sort of known, I would argue, where we've had the Chinese in a sense. They've had a nuclear strategy, which there's a sort of rough consensus in the literature on this, that you could label it as an assured retaliation strategy, where, the purpose of nuclear weapons have been to retaliate or threaten retaliation and to prevent nuclear blackmail. And that has been sort of the only two purposes in Chinese thinking about what nuclear weapons are actually good for, right, traditionally. And then, their nuclear posture has largely fitted that sort of strategy, right? It has been relatively limited. They have kept numbers limited. They have kept, warheads demated from delivery vehicles, stuff like that, which has been sort of consistent with the strategy that they've sort of put out there in a sense. And I think the modernization that you've seen up until now also, when they produced road mobile ICBMs in the early 2000s, when they were starting to come online around 2007, that was largely consistent with, a assured retaliation sort of strategy and the traditional approach. But I think the revelations that we're seeing now are again, like, producing some new questions. Like you asked, why are the Chinese doing what they're doing? What are the drivers of this? And I agree largely with you, the list you pointed to there. It fits sort of very well with, if you also look at sort of Chinese debates about its nuclear security environment, right? They are worried about, what they see as an intensification of the US efforts to develop ballistic missile defense. They are worried about things like conventional precision strike weapons, particularly post the INF treaty, with the prospect of US missiles being deployed in Asia, and nuclear so-called counterforce capability. So in a way, it's natural that the Chinese are sort of worried about the survivability of their arsenal and about being able to defeat missile defense. But the challenge is, of course, is that there are other potential explanations for this also. One being, sort of status. The Chinese are increasingly speaking about nuclear weapons as sort of a source of, great power status, which is a new development. So that could be, at least one potential driver of what you're seeing. And more generally, I think what is challenging is that not everyone, it appears, especially in the US, is really buying into this story about this being driven by survivability concerns and missile defense, right? Which feeds into, this uncertainty and broader rivalry that you have a lot of people in the US in particular looking at this and seeing, like, look, this has to be more ambitious. This has to be something else, right? Also, in terms of strategy, I would argue that what we're seeing is so far still consistent with its, sort of traditional strategy and their assured retaliation strategy. There's nothing that the Chinese are doing which necessarily has to sort of break with its traditional approach when it comes to nuclear weapons. But the problem is particularly if this modernization really continues and if they're developing lots of new weapons and capabilities, right, that it will enable shifts in strategy, potentially in a more offensive direction. So the conclusion, I guess, I said I was going to muddy the waters, and I guess that's what I'm doing, is that we're entering more uncertain territory now. Nuclear weapons are definitely going to feature more prominently, I would say, in the broader China-US rivalry that we're seeing. We need to have more of these discussions, and I think you need to keep on doing the good work that we're doing so we know as much as possible about the Chinese nuclear posture in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to Nupi for the opportunity to talk to you all. And yeah, I think I just want to echo, I mean, you have done a great service, right, to the expert community, to the general public, I think, by alerting us all, right, to these things. And it's not necessarily easy work, right? I'm sure it's probably quite tedious as well, some of that work, getting to the nitty-gritty of all that. I think I'm going to muddy the waters too, but I think I'm going to focus in, I'm going to zero in on one of the particular potential explanations for why China is doing what it's doing. It reflects my own interests. When I look at China nuclear weapons issues, the two sort of avenues or lenses through which I look at that is namely domestic politics and history. So I kind of want to tell a parallel story to the technical build-up story that you've heard today, which is the political story, the political build-up, right, of these weapons. And, you know, I think there's a real temptation, you know, even if you just watch the news and you don't speak Chinese or read Chinese, there will be a great temptation to say, my goodness, Xi Jinping, China's top leader, seems like a very strong authoritarian leader with big visions, big ideas, right? World-class military and the like. So it would be very tempting to say, he's the man who's changed it all, right? And that's really not quite the case, right? We can actually trace the broader elevation in status, so Henrik mentioned status, and sort of how nuclear weapons have acquired greater value domestically, even before Xi Jinping. The key is that Xi Jinping has just taken that and he's sort of upped the volume, right? So I want to sort of highlight three particular areas where you see this political build-up. So in a way, it's kind of a somber story to go with the technical story that you've heard today. So the first is that in terms of how politics and how policy gets decided, there's an institution in China that's very important. It's called the Central Military Commission, the CMC. And in 2005, so this was before Xi Jinping became the leader, and of course when he became leader, he also became head of the CMC, which isn't always the case in China at the same time. This was the time of Hu Jintao, and Hu Jintao at the time didn't have the military clout that Xi Jinping has almost always had, actually, since he's been leader. But in 2005, something very important happened with the CMC. What happened was, suddenly, China's services, so this included the very powerful PLA Navy, which is in charge of those subs that Hans mentioned, but it also invited what was called then the 2nd Artillery Corps. They're now called the PLA Rocket Forces, but they're essentially the same thing. And they were invited to have a seat at the table in the CMC. That had never happened before, which is actually, on the face of it, quite shocking. But it was a big bureaucratic turning point, and this happened, obviously, in the Hu Jintao era, not in the Xi Jinping era. And in fact, even though Hu Jintao never had the, you could argue, military clout, or a strong military base for his power, he did pay periodically visits to the 2nd Artillery, right, in 2006, I think in 2008. But when Xi Jinping came to power, he has, by my count, had at least 4 important public meetings with China's nuclear forces. And there's been a lot of sort of PR around these. It's been a very public sort of big show, right, in a way that it wasn't such a big show when Hu Jintao paid visits to China's nuclear forces. But also in the Xi Jinping era, we've seen in 2015, at the end of 2015, big bureaucratic changes again. The renaming of the 2nd Artillery, becoming the People's Liberation Army Rocket Forces. Their elevation as well in terms of their status as a service. And the creation of another new service, the PLA Strategic Support Force, which also has a strategic deterrent mission in support of the rocket forces. So there are a number of explanations for this. You could argue, looking at it from a technological perspective, that they need this because of modernization and the increases that they're doing. But there is also this political, domestic political explanation. I think that's very helpful here. Firstly, the PLA Navy have had a huge part of the budget, of the military budget and funding. It's been a priority for China to have, a blue water navy for a very long time. And that's eaten up a lot of resources and a lot of capacity. So creating the PLA rocket forces was a way of protecting and earmarking money, not just for the nuclear forces, but actually also for cyber and space, which are also big growing priorities since the 2000s. So this was a way of domestically, from a political economy perspective, protecting China's nuclear forces. But it was also about reducing rivalry between the services as they, obviously, like Hans said, as they're coming online. I mean, if they do indeed end up having 1,000 or more missiles by 2030 or whenever, that's going to create quite a lot to handle, right, for all these different services. How is the Navy going to work with the Air Force when they have their bombers, if they have their bombers, and so forth? So this was an attempt, I think, a start, actually. It's not the end. I think we will see more bureaucratic changes, but this was a start to deal with potential competition and rivalry between services as China gets bigger, right, in nuclear terms. I also think it's a way of upping the general sense of what are our nuclear forces for, right? If you're a Chinese citizen, right, why should you care, right, about your Chinese? It is about great power, for sure. Ever since Deng Xiaoping era, and ever, for sure. I think that's certainly the case, and even more so in the Xi Jinping era, and the pressure that Xi Jinping is under, right, to show that China, has really made a success of it, right, since it became the People's Republic of China in 1949, and in 2049 they'll have their 100th centenary, right? So there is that pressure there, for sure, right, I think for sure. But it's also true that historically in China, if you look at the relationship between society and its military, it actually is not as positive as you would think. Being a member of the PLA doesn't actually bring you a huge amount of social status. It never actually has. It's always been actually a struggle for the party, and by the party I mean the Communist Party, to actually sell to the Chinese public the value, right, of being part of the military. And the same is true of China's strategic forces. Retention, pension issues, these are actually big issues for China's forces. So I think there's another story going on here, and Xi Jinping seems to be actively dealing with it. I guess that's what I'm suggesting. And the last area that you see Xi Jinping doing more than maybe his predecessors is that he's looking back. He's looking back at Chinese nuclear history, and he's saying, listen, guys, we should remember, and we should celebrate some of our things that we've done in the past, right? And this is a new thing, right? Again, it did start slightly earlier under Hu Jintao, but the difference is now is that Xi Jinping is doing it at a much greater pace, right? And of course he's doing it selectively. I had a good conversation about this with Henrik yesterday. He's focusing on selective history, right? He's focusing in particular on the projects that China led Liangdian and Xing, for instance, the two bombs, one satellite project, which didn't involve the Russians, the Soviets, right? So we focus on those parts of our nuclear history where we should demonstrate self-resilience and so forth, right? But it's a big deal in the Xi Jinping era. You don't need to be living in China. And of course, in the past few years, China specialists haven't been able to go to China, but even if you can see what is on the news, you can see the types of soap operas and so forth, the editorials and the museums that are being developed and so forth. A lot of this is about celebrating nuclear excellence and nuclear science from China's past. And so, of course, one of the main reasons is we need to celebrate this. This is a great achievement. It's important, right, to our identity and so forth. But it's also actually linked to this broader, again, if I'm circling back, to this idea of what does it mean to be a world-class military, right? It's not just about these visible big weapons that you can identify, very dramatically, as in the photos Hans showed. But it's also about being a cyber power, a space power, right? And here, actually, I think there's a very interesting sort of dimension to my work on commemoration, how Xi Jinping celebrates that, is that he's focusing in on the science of it all. He's focusing on the fact that these scientists, the nuclear scientists he's looking at, Chen Shuo-shen and people like that, he's saying, listen, these guys were working under incredibly hard circumstances, economically, politically, very hostile environment. They did, at a certain point in time, between 1960 and 1963, they were super isolated, right? They had broken their relations with the Soviet Union. They didn't have good relations with the United States. They were really, really on their own, North Korea style, right? And yet, out of all that, they managed it, right? And so he's turning to those cyber scientists, the space scientists. He's like, up your game, right? Get a move on. You can do this. You can actually make China a world-class cyber power and space power. They managed that in the 1960s with far less resources and support. So let me just wind this down really quickly and sort of address the broader question that the two presenters did before, which is, what does this all mean? If we have a technical build-up, if we have a political build-up, what does this all mean? Well, I don't think... I don't want to end on a negative note. I think that there are both positives and negatives when you look at the political side of how China thinks about its nuclear weapons. Yes, on the one hand, you do see the social status of it increasing. But it's also true that there are political devices that have been in place in China for a very long time, and the most famous of these is no first use, right, which is hotly debated and so forth, right? This is ultimately a political device. It is not a military or strategic concept or device, right? It serves diplomatic purposes. So, for instance, China, when it's pushed into a corner in arms control, can say, no, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the International No First Use Treaty, which, of course, is not going to have any luck, but that's something that they can throw out. It also demonstrates difference and restraint, which is important to China's broader brand, right, as a nuclear weapons state. So when we ask this question of, does a technical build-up suggest that perhaps China is moving away from no first use because of no first use and its relationship to assured retaliation as a strategy? I always say that's the wrong question to ask, right? The better questions are, what are the political circumstances? What are the political conditions under which China would consider abandoning no first use? In other words, when would no first use no longer be politically valuable or alternatively be seen as politically damaging? That, for me, are two far more interesting questions to ask when we're thinking about no first use, because frankly, like Henrik has said, we've been going around in circles, right, in the expert community, and we've been studying this topic for quite some time. And so, you have to start thinking about no first use outside of the box. You can't simply think of it as a technically driven question. And my view, I think, is fairly positive. We've come off of the back of 2 days, as Sela said, of very interesting talks. And I think ultimately, no first use is fairly easy for China to maintain. It would be very costly for it to abandon it in reputational terms. So I think China will actually try very hard to keep no first use in place for as long as it can politically and technically, right? For as long as it possibly can. So I guess I wanted to muddy the waters, but I also wanted to sort of bring to bear and bring light to sort of the political story. And I think the political story is a somewhat negative story, but there are sort of still light, I think, in the political story too, and I'll leave it there.
Very well. Before I open the floor, I wonder whether you, Hans, would like to exercise your right of response to the two commentaries.
Well, I would, on one particular note here, on Nicola's analysis, which I think is very astute and important, because one of the sort of almost automatic conclusions coming out of the observation of what China is doing is what you saw on some of the slides, the statements from U.S. Strategic Command, that this implies that China is moving to a force posture with nuclear forces on high alert, with radar, satellite-based warning, launch on warning posture, that calls into question the Chinese commitment to the no first use policy. That is where they're trying to sort of steer this debate right now. So it's interesting to hear the political, social side of this, because it's, I mean, I'm living in this kind of very military world of analysis, and we miss that sometimes completely. And in my view, there's nothing in the military technical that in and of itself indicates that China is going to drop the no first use policy. They could easily have forces on full alert, radar-based detections, what have you, and still keep a no first use policy. It doesn't contradict it necessarily. So I think that's just an important point to make, bringing this back to sort of the technical military rivalry that always begins with worst case scenarios.
Thank you. Questions, comments, please.
Hello. I have a question. Your organization, the people you work with, speak mostly of strategic arms. Am I correct?
Oh, everything.
Okay, so the question would be, do you track tactical ability also?
Yes.
And is there a correlation between when you would transition from strategic to tactical nuclear?
Historically, yes, there was a transition. You could say by today's technologies, the first focus of nuclear weapons was tactical. It was a technical challenge to get range. The only range they had in those days were bombers. But as soon as you start seeing land-based systems coming in, they tended to be overwhelmingly tactical in our terms, not yet strategic range. So if you look at the development of the U.S. nuclear stockpile over the years, it looks like this, and it goes up like that, and then it plateaus in the late 60s. And ever since that point, it essentially trickled down, right? That huge upswing early on were tactical nuclear weapons, like just producing it for every scenario you could possibly think of. And later they figured out, and especially when they get longer range weapons, didn't really need that stuff. So it fizzled out over the years, but went a lot faster after the end of the Cold War, of course. Other countries are a little different and interesting these days. If you look at India, Pakistan, for example, all of their forces are described as strategic forces. Well, except Pakistan has one they describe as tactical. But overwhelmingly, they're characterized as strategic nuclear forces, even though they don't have intercontinental range. But for them, the role is strategic. It is, in their context, they're describing it. So there are different ways that countries talk about it and describe what they have. But many of the characteristics of those systems, if they were in a Russian arsenal, would be called tactical. And there's also a tendency in the public domain to sort of say, oh, something is tactical if it is low yield, right? You say, well, tactical nuclear weapons, oh, that's low yield because they can get away with that kind of stuff. That's far too simplistic. I mean, there's a wide range of yield options in weapons. Some tactical nuclear weapons, yes, have low yield, but there are also strategic nuclear weapons that have low yield options. Some tactical nuclear weapons have very high yield, even like 10 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb that destroyed Hiroshima during World War II. So there's a lot of blur between this. So there are people who think it's very important to categorize nuclear weapons like that. There are other people who say it is irrelevant. All nuclear weapons are strategic in their nature. Whether it's a short range you pop somewhere or this is a long range strategic, it is a strategic event.
If I can ask another question.
There are many hands up, so I want to give you all the chance. Since I do not know all of you, please tell your names and institutional affiliations when you take the floor. I think I saw you already early on.
Thank you. My name is Trond Inge. I work at the section for export control in Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. My question is, should we really worry? Is there any point with these missile silos? Because I think some of the reason why Russia and US have this is like they're working as a nuclear sponge. You know, it's a target for enemies. But in US, I think they're starting to go away from this, and because they're extremely expensive to maintain and upgrade, and they focus more on submarines because they're much more difficult to detect. So is it perhaps more that it's maybe like Germany in the early 1900s that bought a big navy because that's something the big guys have? or is someone is also maybe against India or Russia or other countries, not only US?
I would like to collect a few questions before we get back to the presenters. Did you ask for? Yeah, right.
Thank you very much. My name is Babar Amin, and I'm ambassador of Pakistan. I would like to ask that has there been any study of the linkages between the efforts of the Western countries led by US to have a certain economic throwback or pushback to China, for example, and also some trade initiatives that were taken back in last, let's say, a decade onwards. And particularly, one example for that is the recently launched Asia-Pacific Economic Bloc. While there is already a regional regional cooperation for economic partnership is already there, which has a larger membership. So in the face of that regional economic cooperation bloc, launching another bloc. So all those initiatives to economically and trade-wise trying to push back China and to contain it, as the word is sometimes used. So is there any linkages between these developments and China's nuclear build-up, especially like was mentioned that maybe there's an indication of their abandoning the no first use ultimately. And secondly, one clarification I'll quickly make. You said that India, Pakistan do not have intercontinental ballistic missiles, but Agni 5 is projected to have between 5,000 to 8,000 kilometers range. You can check that when this test was made. Also at that time, there were write-ups that India's Agni 5 missile has 5,000 to 8,000 projected range. Thank you.
These are big questions, so maybe we get back to you now, or whoever would like to respond to.
I would really want to hear your thoughts on the economic side there, because I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, no, as I mentioned, we had some discussions yesterday, and yesterday I talked actually about sort of the economic aspects of US-China relations moving forward, and I was thinking in particular of the war in Ukraine, of course, the massive sanctions regime that has been placed on Russia, and China is observing that very closely, of course, to see what tools the West has economically, but also the robustness and sustainability of the West to implement those kind of tools, right? Because it's thinking, China it's thinking of, if we were to invade, for instance, and this is just a scenario, but if we had to, for whatever reasons, right, and remember that China does have a legal prerequisite to actually intervene potentially militarily in Taiwan since 2005 with the anti-succession law. So if that were to happen in the future, and it were to use military force to take Taiwan, what kind of sanctions would China expect to be targeted with, right? So at the moment, it's in many respects an open book for China to read if it looks at Russia and how it's facing those kind of sanctions. But I think more broadly, China, of course, has endured huge amount of sanctions for many years, right? It's had targeted sanctions against proliferation concerns, including vis-a-vis Pakistan, where the US has targeted specific Chinese companies and individuals. And actually, they've been fairly successful in using these targeted sanctions versus other more general sanctions that they've used in the past. As a result, China has actually improved significantly. I mean, you said before, said you're an expert on export control. I mean, they have actually improved their game on export controls. Clearly not as good as some other countries, but they have improved quite significantly, and that you could argue is in part because of a sanctions regime. So not all sanctions fail to some extent. At the moment in the US, they are investigating lots of different options of sanctions. There are bills being discussed among senators. There are studies being undertaken in the Treasury as to what kind of options the US has economically to use. So I think this is still very much behind closed doors, but there's something that's actively researching. And Henrik, did you want to add to that?
Is there military pushback from India, Henrik?
If there is a military pushback against China in the sense of this buildup, right? Well, I mean, I think we discussed this over the last couple of days, and so far, I mean, it seems like the conclusion from many Indian scholars is like that it is not having that much of an impact on Indian nuclear strategy and thinking so far what the Chinese are doing. But I think, I mean, it seems like they are cautiously sort of observing this and thinking that, okay, if this trajectory sort of continues, it could have implications for us too, and I mean our nuclear modernization and what we need. But also, if I could, I wanted to add a little bit also to the question of the, because I heard you mention the word containment there, and I think, I mean, as I sort of mentioned, right, it's still very much, it's difficult to really find and isolate and identify the drivers of the developments we're seeing now. And I mean, I think some of the sort of technical rationales that you can point to in terms of the build-up that you're seeing by China, that they need a larger arsenal to ensure survivability and everything, that you can make a pretty strong case for a lot of that. But I think, and I've seen other people make this argument too, that, I mean, the sort of broader rivalry and the perception of containment, because I think the Chinese truly believe that, I mean, that a containment policy is what they're seeing from the US. You can agree or disagree with it, but I think that's the perception. And that may have contributed to developments that we're seeing, because they basically see a US that they think of as more hostile, and that, I mean, the likelihood of any sort of armed conflict, for instance, over Taiwan or over other issues, has sort of increased, right? But it's hard to sort of disentangle these things from each other, but I do not think it's implausible that it could have at least contributed to a desire to sort of build up your forces.
The one particular question about the ICBMs, yeah, it's a good question. Are they still valuable or meaningful? So the mistake you make is to use logic. Because in the military planning, in the military posturing, it's not necessarily about that. It's a lot about other things too, like turf. The institutions compete with each other. They want to have status. It's about history, tradition, all sorts of things. And so you would see in the United States, even though I completely agree that I think in the United States nuclear posture, the most important part of it is the ballistic missile submarine fleet. Not just in terms of survivability, actually also in terms of what it can do. But the ICBMs live on as this sort of land-based symbol of, you know, readiness. And there are people in the military who tell you, if these ICBMs were not on alert, they would be gone. You know, they would not keep them if they were not on alert. They serve no particular purpose beyond that. And so they have to hold on to this alert posture here. But in other countries, it's very different, of course, because they don't have that history. And they can look at it very differently. I mean, in Britain's case, for example, they've never gone the ICBM route. They've now entirely on ballistic missile submarines. That's the only platform they have. The French have some bombers left, fine, but the core of their posture is also ballistic missile submarines. So it's very different from country to country. And so now we're getting to the point, the last question there was like, where is India going? India's missiles are getting longer range. And in my view, they're not quite at ICBM range. They're sort of bumping up against it. And so that's the next generation. If they go to an Agni 5, or sorry, Agni 6, that's probably where you're going to see the real ICBM range. But the question is, of course, why would India need an ICBM, full ICBM range? What is the adversary? You know, there's Pakistan, there's China. What are they going to aim for longer away than that? And so they're also driven, of course, and limited by their geopolitical circumstances. And so it's not given to me that we'll necessarily see them go there. But sometimes ICBMs can be important status symbols, you know, of course.
Doesn't have to go with biologic.
Yeah, exactly.
I question there.
Hi. Thanks very much for three really fascinating presentations. I had a question about the relationship between China's no first use policy and stability, especially given the context of China's increasingly capable conventional forces. And in that context, would they need anything else than the ability to deter US first use? For example, in a Taiwan contingency, it may be enough just to be able to respond at the strategic or the theatre level to a US strike, deter a US first use, and be able to be able to accomplish their objectives in Taiwan. So so it may not be that we necessarily have to see an abandonment of no first use to have greater instability. And sorry, I'm James Cameron from the Oslo Nuclear Project at the University of Oslo.
I saw some more hands a moment ago. There.
The Norwegian data center for the test ban treaty. A couple of years ago, there were some very public accusations by the US that China is testing nuclear weapons, low yield. They weren't very substantiated, but they were very official and very public. So I'm curious to hear, sort of from a technical point of view, are they, I mean, could the Americans actually substantiate it? What do you think? And do you know if they could? And from a political point of view, why would the Americans go out like this and not really substantiate these claims at all? They accuse Russia as well in the same document and speech, but they had more documentation on Russia. But yeah, over.
Great questions. I don't know if, can I jump in?
Yeah.
So the no first use there and stability. It's an odd thing that when we talk about stability, we tend to sort of hone in on no first use or first use quite often, and of course, even though China has a no first use policy, it can use nuclear weapons first if it decides to do so. Somebody presses the button and they fly first. You know, that's a first use. The question is, do you have a posture where you signal a certain willingness to use nuclear weapons potentially first to achieve something specific? And so is there an objective by dropping no first use that you want to signal that now we're actually lowering our threshold, and so don't you dare come in? You know, in that case, it can either deter really effectively, countries stay away, they don't want to do it, or they take the bait essentially and engage in that. It can reinforce also countries' determination that this just shows that we really have to stand up to this. But again, I don't see the Chinese going that way. I mean, I see the Chinese building an enormous conventional force specifically to be able to do those kind of scenarios. And I agree that at the end of the day, it's not going to matter whether it's going to be first use or not first use. The fact that they have substantial nuclear forces that are secure and can retaliate is the deterrence to the extent nuclear weapons can play a role, I think. So, but then again, there's a temptation in the public debate to say, as long as something is not nuclear, therefore it's great. And the problem with very advanced and very capable conventional forces And what you can do with them is, of course, also that you can increase pathways to a decision to use nuclear weapon. If you kick in the door and force a country up against the wall and losing, will they go nuclear even though it's entirely a conventional campaign? So there are all these uncertainties that I don't know how they're going to play out in this case. I also want to just remark on the second one here. Why on earth would the U.S. Raise the issue without substantiating it? Yeah, exactly. But whether they have real information, I presume they have real information, you can't spill that out in the open. I mean, of course, it would reveal classified information. Did you get it from spies? What were the means of collection of this information? How accurate it is compared to what actually happened? These types of things can give away information about your collection of intel. So they definitely don't want to do that. This was spilled by the Trump administration. They wanted to shame the Chinese and say, you're bad, you're doing bad stuff, But now we're here again, it's out. They didn't do much about that issue in the latest State Department treaty compliance report. They mention it, but they didn't add anything to the issue at all. So for right now, it's sort of on standby. We're waiting to see what happens. I presume the Chinese are conducting subcritical nuclear tests like the United States and the Russians. Whether they occasionally violate and have a very small yield, maybe. I can't. The question is, though, so what? Does it give them a military advantage that they otherwise couldn't get, that we're going to suffer from? There, I think the judges or the jury is out, right? There's no indication that this is going to in any way rock the boat in terms of the big picture.
To my recollection, that charge came at a time when the Trump administration wanted to delete Clinton's signature on the CTBT. So it was part of a campaign. And a similar charge was made, to my recollection, against Russia, without any specific information being given. So presumably what they could refer to was only subcritical tests, zero yield testing, which is allowed under the treaty. Who is next?
Can I just add a little bit on the NFU question? I think that's...
Certainly can.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And you raised an important question there, James, also, because, in addition to what Nicola has been saying about, why it doesn't make a lot of sense for political reasons to sort of skip NFU, which I think is a really, really important point. I agree, and what I sort of understood to be where you were coming from and hinting at that, with the conventional balance of force tilting in China's favor, it would indeed be a bit of an odd time to drop the NFU. Even though you shouldn't simplify it too much, but the sort of general tendency is like being conventionally inferior, states that are conventionally inferior tend to rely on sort of first use strategies and not the other way around, right? You could argue if China should have dumped NFU, it should have done it years ago, not at this point of time when, the conventional balance of force is increasingly tilting in its direction. And yes, so, being able to sort of deter the Americans is, yeah.
Just to the extent that I feel that no first use has some sort of strategic relevance or value, I think that card has been played because obviously, we've had over the years certain Chinese retired officials and the like sort of muddying the waters, haven't they, about the application of no first use and what they consider to be their own territory. And of course, Taiwan is considered by Beijing as their own territory. So I think that card has been played. I think what Hans and what Henrik said about the balance of conventional forces and what stability means is far more relevant, I think, than and just to add to the question about testing, if I were to be a representative or represent Chinese interests right now, I would say that when China joined the CTBT, it joined it and it was a technical gamble that it wasn't for other member countries to join, right? China joined in 1996 having only conducted, I think, 45 tests compared to what, Hans probably knows the numbers off by heart, maybe over 700.
More than 1,000.
Right, well, 1,000, there you go. So,
Yeah, exactly.
so that, if I were sort of defending Chinese interests here, I would say if that is true, then it has perhaps technical reasons to do so, particularly if you've just watched Hans's presentation as well and the technical build-up. I'm not representing Beijing, but I'm just giving that sort of angle to it as well.
Who was next? Presumably, Hans, early warning, well-functioning early warning systems are increasingly important also for China. What do we know about the status? And in that connection, not long ago we could read a few sentences in the papers about Russian-Chinese cooperation in the establishment of early warning systems. Not much information was given, and I, for one, would believe that if they were to cooperate on that, this would amount to or come very close to a military alliance, the basis for which otherwise do not exist in my view, because there is no common history, there is no common culture. Some of the main pillars of the Atlantic Alliance simply do not exist between China and Russia. But what is known about early warning systems?
So what we've heard recently is that not only just in terms of the general sort of accusation that China is moving toward a launch on warning posture, where it could put missiles on high alert with warheads, and then have some satellite-based detection that could see, rockets coming toward China, and then feed that into a command and control system. That's a posture the United States and Russia have had for many, many, many decades. And that's why right now American ICBMs are on high alert, and they're hooked into that command and control system that's looking for Russian ICBMs coming over the North Pole, and it's been running for a long time. But for China, they haven't had that capability before. And so the assumption is now that because they're building all these ICBMs, therefore they will do it. But there is one more element to that accusation, which is that China has actually launched one satellite into space that appears to be sort of a prototype early warning system. And they've had, over the last 5 years, they've had a sort of a handful of exercises they've done where they have practiced how will that work. That this thing is detecting things, feeding the detection into the nuclear command and control system, it goes out to the launch units, and they can react within a certain period of time. So there's a number of exercises where they're clearly training this kind of scenario. And so in the future, you can imagine, suppose they get another handful of missiles out there so they can actually cover, significant portions of where they have to cover, and feed that in through the command and control system that's much more capable than the one they have today, that eventually at some point they'll get to that capability. But then again, so what? I think the only place where that really matters is what I talked about in my briefing, that it squeezes the Chinese leadership into a box where they have to decide whether they want to launch within less than 30 minutes. And so that's the danger here, that increases crisis instability. So in terms of the Russian help, yes, we saw that statement, and that was pretty much it. I have not heard any specifics about supplying, stuff. And I've heard some speculations about what it means, and most of the speculations are sort of about, helping the Chinese develop the technology and all these types of things, sort of a backup technology, because they're already relying on Russian supply of, the S-400 air defense system that has some limited ballistic missile defense capability. Who knows if they're going to get the S-500 in the future or something like that, but that would be an avenue. But much more important a part of that, of course, is this, will this satellite capability, will this nuclear command and control capability be a Chinese system? Or will you have some kind of dual feeding into sensors from the two countries? That, I think, is not in China's interest, and not some of the Chinese leader. They're looking long term. They know Russia is a country that is on its way down. it's not going to be a strong partner for China in the future.
Can I just, add to that? I think this is where also history can sort of be interesting, because historically China did have it had an alliance with the Soviet Union, right, until 59, 60. And there was a wider reason why that relationship broke down, but there was close cooperation, including on China's bomb program, including on sort of missile defense cooperation. And since then, there's been quite a lot of revisionist history in China, in Chinese sources, about that cooperation. And the argument is not that we were indebted to the Soviets, but rather they helped us to help themselves so that they could spy on us and use it against us in the future. And I wonder whether that an element of that, this is incredibly cynical, of course, and suspicious, but I wonder if there is an element that is at play here still today, with that kind of high-level cooperation at technical level.
Did I miss out on anybody? If not, the meeting is coming to an end. Thank you very much, all three. Let us give them a big hand. And I can only wish you a good afternoon. The meeting is adjourned.